recurring themes of all the witnesses has been the globalization of these markets. And from your perspective at the Council on Foreign Relations, I presume you spend a lot of time looking at overseas markets as well as U.S. markets. How would you sort of rate what's going on overseas relative to what Dodd-Frank is trying to create here in the United States at this time?
I used to be on the board of a European exchange, so I got to see some of that firsthand. I would describe the situation in most of the European Union as being confusion. First of all, there are contradictions across national jurisdictions. For the example, the UK is taking very different approaches on certain issues, such as bank capital requirements, from the rest of the European Union. Second of all, there were regulatory approaches that were put in place before the financial crisis that are widely seen now as being inappropriate, but are still being pushed forward by inertia. I had referred briefly in my testimony, for example, to the European Commission's spaghetti model approach for clearinghouses. Prior to the financial crisis, the European Commission wanted to see clearinghouses compete more against each other, and they felt that the way to do that was to compel them to provide interoperability, technological linkages one to another. My concern is that that could produce enormous operational risks that could spread from one institution to another and could lead to a situation where the clearinghouses compete by lowering their margin requirements and other prudential requirements and could undermine their ability to make sure that we have a safe and sound securities trading system. So I think we're more advanced over here right now in terms of having a coherent approach. And although I have differences on some approaches, I think the thrust is going in the right direction, and it's a matter of refining individual details.
Let me just follow up and ask perhaps the same question a different way, and also ask Dr. Spat to comment. There's a real issue here of going forward. Are we advantaged by these reforms or disadvantaged, particularly the competition with the European community and some of our Asian financial centers? And so your sense going forward, then I'll ask Dr. Spat.
Depends on the individual issue. Let's take the issue of clearing certain contracts that are traded in multiple jurisdictions. I mentioned briefly in my testimony natural gas and oil futures contracts. These contracts are traded both by the NYMEX exchange, which is owned by the CME, which is regulated by the CFTC, and by the Intercontinental Exchange, which, interestingly enough, although it's an American exchange, trades certain of these contracts out of London, so to speak. Of course, this is a keystroke that determines a jurisdiction under FSA regulations. Margin requirements can differ on contracts that are traded in different jurisdictions. And in terms of the current debate, for example, on position limits on certain commodities, you've seen in the markets evidence that any time it looks like position limits may be instituted in the U.S. market, say in natural gas and oil contracts, that open interest shifts from NYMEX to ICE. I don't think this is incidental. There's great concern in the markets that if position limits are implemented here and not overseas, that institutions will be forced to liquidate positions in order to get under those requirements. And so they start increasing their open interest overseas. And I think that's the sort of regulatory arbitrage we need to be concerned about.
Dr. Spat, your comments, and then I